Long before Alduin cast his shadow across the peaks of Skyrim, before the World Eater awakened to devour time itself, Bethesda saw a different end entirely. One that would have come not from the dawn of creation, but from the ashes of empire dreams and the bitter taste of defeat. In the earliest idea stages of what would become the Elder Scrolls V, the main enemy was not to be an ancient dragon of myth and legend, but rather a figure far more human in his start, yet perhaps even more scary in what he meant. Uriel Septim V, the warrior emperor who had vanished into the strange continent of Akavir centuries before, was meant to return as an undead ruler, leading armies of dragons to take back what he believed was rightfully his. This different story would have totally changed, not just the direct story of Skyrim, but the entire path of Elder Scrolls lore moving forward, showing players an enemy whose reasons were rooted not in ancient hunger for destruction, but in very human wants for power, legacy, and the bitter sting of unfinished business. The idea was finally dropped, thought too similar to the story threads of A Song of Ice and Fire, but the shadow of what might have been continues to interest those who dig deep into the making history of the Elder Scrolls. To understand why Uriel Septim V would have made such a strong and scary enemy, we must first look at the man he was in life, for it is in his human wins and failures that we find the seeds of his undead dreams. Born into the Septim family during the height of empire power, Uriel V got the throne in the year 268 of the Third Era, rising to rule an empire that stretched across nearly all of known Tamriel. Yet, unlike many of his before rulers who were happy to keep the status quo or deal with inside fighting, Uriel had an endless hunger for growth that would define both his rule and his final downfall. From the moment he took power, his gaze turned outward, beyond the familiar borders of Tamriel to the unconquered lands that lay across the seas. This was not mere wanderlust or the idle curiosity of a bored king, but rather a planned strategy to unite his empire through outside conquest, to give his people a common cause that would go beyond the petty fights and local tensions that had long troubled empire unity. His first target was the island of Roskria, a frozen landmass to the north that had remained free despite its closeness to empire lands. The conquest began in year 271 of the Third Era and needed 4 years of constant military effort, showing both Uriel's commitment to his growth vision and the tough challenges that awaited him in his future campaigns. Roskreia was merely the beginning, a testing ground for the strategies and supply systems that would be needed for far more ambitious undertakings. Following this success, Uriel turned his attention to Kathnaki in year 276, then to Yenezlia in year 279, and finally to Azroniat in year 284. Each conquest added to the growing legend of the warrior emperor, but more importantly, each victory served as training for the ultimate prize that had captured his imagination from the very beginning of his rule. Akavir, the strange eastern continent, had long held a place of interest and terror in the minds of Tamrielic scholars and military planners. This was the land from which the Akaviri had come in ages past to conquer and rule parts of Tamriel, leaving behind building marvels, fighting traditions, and tempting hints about the nature of their homeland. For Uriel Septim V, Akavir represented the ultimate test of empire might, the conquest that would cement his legacy as the greatest warrior emperor since Tiber Septim himself. The very difficulty of such an undertaking, the vast distance across dangerous seas, the complete unknown nature of what awaited his armies on those foreign shores, all of this only served to fuel his determination rather than discourage it. For 20 years, from 268 to the year 288, Uriel prepared for this ultimate campaign. This was not the hasty decision of an impulsive ruler, but rather the carefully orchestrated plan of a strategic genius who understood that conquering Akavir would require resources, planning, and coordination on a scale never before attempted in Tamrielic history. Every aspect of the empire was mobilized toward this single goal, from the recruitment and training of specialized legions capable of overseas deployment to the construction of an enormous naval fleet that could transport and supply an army across the vast expanse of the Padomaic Ocean. The economic implications alone were staggering, as the imperial treasury was gradually drained to fund this massive undertaking, but Uriel remained convinced that the rewards would justify any sacrifice. In the year 288 of the Third Era, at the height of his power and after 2 decades of meticulous preparation, Uriel Septim V launched his invasion of Akavir. The initial stages of the campaign exceeded even his most optimistic projections, as his legions encountered minimal resistance and quickly established footholds on the continent. 2 cities fell to imperial forces and were renamed Septimia and Ionith in honor of the conquering emperor, seeming to validate his grand vision and suggesting that Akavir might prove less formidable than its fearsome reputation had suggested. For a brief moment, it appeared that Uriel's gamble would pay off spectacularly, that he would indeed claim his place among the greatest conquerors in history. Yet Akavir had merely been observing, learning, preparing its response to this foreign intrusion. The continent that had produced warrior cultures capable of conquering portions of Tamriel was not about to submit meekly to imperial rule, regardless of the initial successes achieved by Uriel's forces. In the year 290 of the Third Era, just 2 years after the invasion began, the Akaviri struck back with devastating effect at the Battle of Ionith. This engagement would prove to be not merely a defeat, but an absolute catastrophe that shattered the imperial forces and claimed the life of Emperor Uriel Septim V himself. The details of exactly what transpired during this battle remain shrouded in mystery, as few survivors returned to Tamriel to tell the tale, but the consequences were immediately and permanently clear. The disaster of Ionith, as it came to be known in imperial histories, marked the end of the Third Empire's expansionist phase and ushered in a period of retrenchment and internal focus that would characterize the remainder of the Third Era. The enormous costs of the failed invasion, both in terms of manpower and treasury resources, left the empire weakened and vulnerable to the various crises that would follow in subsequent decades. More immediately, the death of Uriel Septim V left the throne to his 5-year-old son, Uriel Septim VI, creating a regency situation that would limit imperial authority for years to come. The dream of Akaviri conquest died with its architect on that distant battlefield, or so it seemed to those who recorded the official histories. But in the original conception of Skyrim's narrative, death would prove to be merely an interruption rather than an ending for the ambitions of Uriel Septim V. The proposed storyline would have revealed that the Emperor's defeat at Ionith had not destroyed him, but rather transformed him into something far more dangerous than he had ever been in life. Somehow, through means that would presumably have been revealed through the course of the game's main questline, Uriel had not only survived his apparent death, but had spent the intervening centuries building a new kind of power base among the very people who had defeated him. The army of dragons that players would have encountered would not have been the ancient children of Akatosh awakening from eons of slumber, but rather Akaviri dragons serving under the command of their undead imperial master, a force of conquest returning to claim the throne that Uriel believed remained rightfully his. This alternative narrative would have created a fundamentally different dynamic than what ultimately appeared in the finished game. Instead of facing a primordial force of nature whose motivations were largely incomprehensible to mortal minds, players would have confronted an antagonist whose goals were entirely understandable even if his methods had become monstrous. Uriel Septim V would not have sought the destruction of the world, but rather its conquest, not the ending of time, but the establishment of a new imperial order with himself as its eternal ruler. His return to Tamriel would have been driven by the same ambitions that had motivated his living campaigns, but now enhanced by the bitter knowledge of previous failure and the supernatural power necessary to ensure that such failure would never occur again. The implications of this alternative storyline extend far beyond the immediate plot of Skyrim itself, touching on fundamental questions about the nature of imperial power, the relationship between life and death, and the price of ambition. Unlike Alduin, whose ancient origins placed him largely outside the flow of recorded history, Uriel Septim V was a figure whose life and deeds were well documented, whose motivations could be understood through the lens of human psychology rather than divine or primordial imperatives. This would have created opportunities for far more complex moral and political questions than those raised by the dragon crisis that ultimately appeared in the game. Consider the perspective of the various factions that populate Skyrim's political landscape. The Imperial Legion, still nominally loyal to the Septim legacy, despite the dynasty's official end, would have faced the ultimate test of their allegiances. Would they stand with the legitimate heir of their beloved imperial tradition, even if that heir had returned as an undead conqueror leading foreign dragons? Or would they recognize that the Uriel who had returned was no longer the man they had once served, that death and centuries of brooding resentment had transformed him into something that represented the antithesis of everything the Empire claimed to stand for? The Stormcloaks, already in rebellion against imperial authority, would have found their position complicated by the return of a Septim Emperor whose claim to legitimacy was far stronger than that of the puppet rulers they opposed, yet whose methods and allies marked him as an existential threat to Nordic independence. The religious implications would have been equally fascinating to explore. The imperial cult's worship of Talos, already a contentious issue in Skyrim's political landscape, would have taken on entirely new dimensions with the return of another deified emperor whose claim to divinity was backed not by theological argument but by demonstrable supernatural power. The traditional Nordic pantheon, with its emphasis on honorable death and the warrior's afterlife in Sovngarde, would have struggled to categorize an emperor who had seemingly transcended death not through glorious battle but through some form of dark resurrection. The various Daedric princes, always eager to meddle in mortal affairs, would have found in undead Uriel a potential ally or rival whose power base in Akavir placed him largely outside their traditional spheres of influence. The dragons themselves would have served a fundamentally different narrative function in this alternative storyline. Rather than being presented as a returning natural disaster that required heroic intervention, they would have been tools of conquest wielded by a human intelligence for comprehensible political goals. This would have allowed for far more complex interactions between the player character and these magnificent creatures, potentially including scenarios where certain dragons might be turned against their master through negotiation, trickery, or the revelation of uncomfortable truths about their current situation. The relationship between dragon and emperor would have raised questions about the nature of loyalty, the extent to which intelligent beings can be truly enslaved, and the psychological impact of serving an undead master whose very existence represents a violation of natural order. The Thuum, the dragon shouts that became such a central gameplay mechanic in the final version of Skyrim, would have taken on entirely different significance in this alternative narrative. Instead of being presented as an ancient Nordic art that allowed mortals to speak in the language of dragons, the Thuum might have been revealed as a form of communication and control, developed specifically for managing Akaviri dragons in service to an imperial master. This would have created interesting possibilities for the player character's development, as learning dragon shouts would have meant essentially studying the tools of oppression developed by the very enemy they sought to defeat. The moral implications of using such power, even in service of resistance, would have added layers of complexity to character progression that are largely absent from the final game's more straightforward approach to acquiring and using shouts. The geography of Skyrim itself would have served different narrative purposes under this alternative storyline. Rather than being primarily a stage for ancient conflicts between dragons and mortals, the province would have become a strategic battleground in a very contemporary war for imperial succession. Each hold would have represented not just a distinct culture and political entity, but a potential ally or enemy in the struggle against Uriel's returning forces. The player's choices regarding Civil War participation would have been complicated by the knowledge that both sides might soon face a common enemy whose power dwarfed their petty squabbles, yet whose political legitimacy raised questions about whether resistance was justified or treasonous. The ancient Nordic ruins that dot Skyrim's landscape would have taken on different significance as well. Instead of being primarily repositories of ancient dragon cult artifacts and shouts, these sites might have been revealed as strategic positions established during previous conflicts with Akaviri forces, or as hiding places for treasures and knowledge that could prove crucial in the coming war against the undead emperor. The Draugr that inhabit these tombs might not have been merely ancient Nords cursed to eternal unrest, but rather the remnants of soldiers who died fighting against previous Akaviri incursions, their undead existence serving as a grim preview of what awaited Skyrim if Uriel's conquest succeeded. The various guilds and organizations that operate throughout Skyrim would have found their missions and methods fundamentally altered by the return of an undead Septim Emperor. The Thieves Guild, traditionally focused on personal enrichment through illicit means, might have been forced to choose between profitable collaboration with the new regime and resistance activities that could threaten their very existence. The Dark Brotherhood, already serving supernatural forces through their worship of the Night Mother, would have faced complex questions about whether their assassination contracts extended to undead targets and how their philosophy of death as liberation applied to beings who had seemingly transcended mortality. The College of Winterhold, with its focus on magical research and education, would have found itself at the center of efforts to understand and counter the supernatural powers that enabled Uriel's return and continued existence. The Companions, Skyrim's warrior guild, with its complex relationship to lycanthropy and beast transformation, would have represented perhaps the most interesting parallel to the undead emperor's condition. Both the Companions' wolf transformations and Uriel's undead state represent forms of existence that transcend normal human limitations while potentially compromising the essential humanity of those who embrace them. The question of whether such power is worth the associated costs would have resonated throughout both storylines, creating opportunities for meaningful character development and philosophical exploration that go far beyond simple combat encounters. The Bard's College, often overlooked in discussions of Skyrim's major factions, would have played a crucial role in this alternative narrative as the keepers of historical knowledge and cultural memory. Their songs and stories would have preserved accounts of Uriel Septim V's original campaigns and the disaster of Ionith, potentially providing crucial intelligence about the enemy's methods, weaknesses, and psychological profile. The college's emphasis on performance and persuasion would have made its members valuable allies in any effort to rally popular resistance or undermine support for the returning emperor's claims to legitimacy. The economic implications of Uriel's return would have created additional layers of complexity throughout Skyrim's social and political structures. His original invasion of Akavir had bankrupted the imperial treasury and contributed to decades of economic instability throughout the empire. His return, backed by the wealth and resources of Akavir, would have represented both an opportunity for economic revival and a threat to existing power structures. Merchants and craftsmen would have faced difficult choices between the prosperity that might come from collaboration and the moral implications of supporting a regime built on conquest and supernatural tyranny. The various trading companies and economic guilds would have found their traditional neutrality challenged by the need to choose sides in a conflict that would determine not just political control, but the fundamental nature of life and death itself. The presence of other races throughout Skyrim would have added additional complexity to the political and social dynamics of this alternative storyline. The Dunmer refugees from Morrowind, already struggling with displacement and cultural preservation, would have found their situation complicated by the return of an imperial dynasty that predated their current troubles, but whose methods raised questions about whether imperial protection was worth the associated costs. The Altmer, with their long lifespans and deep knowledge of magical arts, might have possessed crucial insights into the nature of Uriel's undead condition and the means by which it might be countered or exploited. The Orsimer, whose warrior culture emphasized honor in battle and death, would have struggled to categorize an opponent who had seemingly achieved victory through the denial of death itself. The religious landscape of Skyrim would have been fundamentally altered by the return of an undead Septim Emperor whose very existence challenged basic assumptions about the nature of life, death, and divine will. The traditional imperial cult, already strained by the official ban on Talos worship, would have faced the ultimate crisis of faith as they grappled with the return of an emperor whose legitimacy was unquestionable, but whose current state suggested either divine favor of a very dark sort or a fundamental violation of cosmic order. The various Nordic deities, particularly those associated with death and the afterlife, would have found their traditional roles challenged by the existence of a being who appeared to have transcended the normal boundaries between life and death without following the established paths to such transcendence. The Temple of Mara, with its emphasis on love, compassion, and healing, would have struggled to respond to an enemy whose very existence represented a form of suffering that could not be easily relieved or resolved. The priests and priestesses would have faced difficult questions about whether their calling to heal extended to attempting to cure undeath, whether compassion required them to help Uriel find peace through final death, or whether their duty lay in protecting the living from the threat he represented. Similarly, the Temple of Arche, dedicated to the proper cycle of life and death, would have found its fundamental principles challenged by an emperor whose continued existence seemed to mock the natural order they sought to preserve and protect. The Daedric princes, always eager to meddle in mortal affairs, would have found in undead Uriel Septim V a fascinating puzzle and potential opportunity. Molag Bal, the Prince of Domination and Undeath, might have claimed credit for the Emperor's transformation while simultaneously seeking to bring him under direct Daedric control. Mehrunes Dagon, the Prince of Destruction and Change, might have seen in Uriel's return an opportunity to further destabilize the already fragile political order of Tamriel. Hermaeus Mora, the Prince of Knowledge and Memory, would have been intensely interested in the secrets of Akaviri power that had enabled such a transformation, while Sheogorath might have found the entire situation delightfully mad and worthy of further chaos. The various Aedra would have faced their own challenges in responding to this crisis. Akatosh, the dragon god of time, would have found his traditional role as patron of the empire complicated by the return of an undead emperor commanding dragons in service of conquest rather than protection. Talos, the ascended Tiber Septim, would have faced questions about his relationship to his undead successor and whether his divine power extended to influence over other members of his former dynasty. The conflict between divine will and imperial ambition, already a theme in previous Elder Scrolls games, would have reached new heights of complexity with the return of an emperor whose power seemed to transcend normal limitations while serving goals that were difficult to reconcile with traditional concepts of divine justice or cosmic order. The Thu'um itself would have taken on fundamentally different significance in this alternative narrative structure. Instead of being presented as an ancient Nordic art that allowed mortals to participate in the cosmic language of creation, dragon shouts might have been revealed as a form of communication and control developed specifically for managing relationships between mortal commanders and dragon servitors. This would have raised fascinating questions about the nature of language, power, and communication across species barriers. The player character's gradual mastery of dragon shouts would have represented not just increasing combat effectiveness, but growing understanding of the tools and techniques used by their primary enemy. The concept of the Dragonborn would have required fundamental re-examination in this alternative storyline. Rather than being a chosen hero blessed by Akatosh to combat the return of ancient evil, the player character might have been revealed as someone sharing certain essential characteristics with the undead emperor himself. This could have created opportunities for far more complex character development, as players grappled with the possibility that their power to combat dragons came from the same source as their enemy's ability to command them. The moral implications of using similar powers for opposing goals would have added layers of philosophical depth that are largely absent from the final game's more straightforward good versus evil narrative structure. The various dragon encounters throughout the game would have served fundamentally different narrative purposes under this alternative structure. Instead of being primarily combat challenges that tested the player's growing mastery of dragon shouts, each dragon encounter might have been an opportunity to learn more about the enemy's organization, methods, and ultimate goals. Some dragons might have been willing to discuss their service to the undead emperor, potentially providing intelligence about his plans, weaknesses, or the nature of his transformation. Others might have been potential allies who could be turned against their master through persuasion, trickery, or the revelation of uncomfortable truths about their current situation. The relationship between dragons and mortals would have been explored in far greater depth under this alternative narrative structure. Instead of being primarily predatory relationships based on ancient conflicts over dominance, the interactions between dragons and humans might have been revealed as complex political and social arrangements that had evolved over centuries of coexistence in Akavir. This would have provided opportunities to explore themes of cultural exchange, adaptation, and the ways in which different species might learn to cooperate despite fundamental differences in their nature and goals. The ancient Nordic tradition of dragon worship would have taken on entirely new significance in this alternative storyline. Instead of being primarily a historical curiosity that explained the presence of dragon shouts and ancient ruins, the dragon cult might have been revealed as a prescient attempt to prepare for the return of dragon-based threats to Nordic independence. The dragon priests buried in ancient tombs might not have been misguided fanatics who served evil masters, but rather strategic thinkers who understood that accommodation with dragon power was preferable to futile resistance against overwhelming force. The civil war between Imperial Legion and Stormcloak forces would have been fundamentally transformed by the return of an undead Septim Emperor. Both sides would have been forced to reevaluate their positions and goals in light of this new threat that transcended their existing conflict. The Imperial Legion's loyalty to the Septim dynasty would have been tested by the return of a legitimate heir whose methods and allies marked him as a threat to everything the Empire claimed to represent. The Stormcloak's desire for Nordic independence would have been complicated by the need to unite with their former enemies against a common threat whose power dwarfed their petty squabbles. General Tullius, the Imperial commander in Skyrim, would have faced the ultimate crisis of military leadership as he grappled with orders to resist an emperor whose legitimacy was unquestionable, but whose current state suggested either divine favor of a very dark sort or a fundamental placed violation of cosmic order. His training and experience had prepared him to fight rebels and barbarians, not undead emperors commanding supernatural forces beyond normal military comprehension. The strategic and tactical challenges posed by dragon-mounted forces would have required entirely new approaches to warfare that challenged every assumption about combat effectiveness and battlefield control. Ulfric Stormcloak, the rebel leader fighting for Nordic independence, would have found his political position fundamentally altered by the return of a Septim Emperor whose claim to legitimacy was stronger than that of the puppet rulers he opposed. His mastery of the Thu'um, presented in the final game as a return to ancient Nordic traditions, might have been revealed as inadvertent preparation for communication with the very dragons his people would need to resist. The philosophical implications of using imperial tools to fight imperial power would have added complexity to his character development that goes far beyond the relatively straightforward nationalism that motivates him in the finished game. The various Jarls who rule Skyrim's holds would have faced unprecedented challenges as they attempted to navigate between competing loyalties and survival instincts. Those who supported the Empire would have struggled with the return of an emperor whose legitimacy was unquestionable, but whose methods threatened everything they claimed to value. Those who supported the Stormcloak Rebellion would have found their desire for independence complicated by the need for unity against a threat that transcended existing political divisions. The Hold Guards, traditionally focused on maintaining local order and security, would have been forced to confront enemies whose power and methods were beyond their training and experience. Balgruf the Greater, the Jarl of Whiterun, would have found his traditional neutrality impossible to maintain in the face of an existential threat that demanded clear choices and decisive action. His position at the center of Skyrim's transportation network would have made Whiterun a crucial strategic target for any invasion force, while his personal relationships with both Imperial and Stormcloak leaders would have given him unique insight into the political complexities created by the undead Emperor's return. The ancient Dragon's Reach Castle, already associated with dragon lore through its name and history, might have been revealed as a crucial defensive position specifically designed to counter dragon-based threats. The Companions, Skyrim's premier warrior organization, would have faced challenges that went to the heart of their identity and purpose. Their lycanthropic curse, traditionally seen as a burden that enhanced their combat effectiveness at the cost of their humanity, would have provided an interesting parallel to the undead emperor's condition. Both forms of existence transcend normal human limitations while potentially compromising the essential humanity of those who embrace them. The question of whether such power is worth the associated costs would have resonated throughout both storylines, creating opportunities for meaningful character development and philosophical exploration. Kodlak Whitemane, the harbinger of the Companions, would have found his lifelong struggle with the beast blood taking on new dimensions as he confronted an enemy who had seemingly transcended death itself through supernatural means. His desire to find honorable death and entry to Sovngarde would have been complicated by questions about whether traditional concepts of honor and afterlife applied to beings who operated outside normal cosmic boundaries. The Circle's internal debates about the value and costs of lycanthropy would have been enhanced by parallel discussions about the nature of undeath and the prices paid for supernatural power. Ayla, the Huntress, with her embrace of the beast blood and her role as a trainer in archery and hunting, would have found her skills and philosophy tested by prey, unlike any she had previously encountered. Dragons represent the ultimate hunting challenge, combining intelligence, supernatural power, and centuries of experience in ways that transcend normal predator-prey relationships. Her acceptance of lycanthropy as a tool for enhanced effectiveness would have provided an interesting contrast to those who viewed undeath as an abomination to be destroyed rather than a condition to be understood and potentially exploited. The College of Winterhold, Skyrim's premier institution for magical research and education, would have found itself at the center of efforts to understand and counter the supernatural forces that enabled Uriel's return and continued existence. The college's traditional focus on theoretical research and academic discussion would have been challenged by the immediate practical need to develop countermeasures against an enemy whose power seemed to transcend normal magical categories. The relationship between the college and the rest of Skyrim, already strained by suspicion and fear of magical practitioners, would have been further complicated by the college's crucial role in the province's defense. Savos Aren, the Archmage of the College of Winterhold, would have faced unprecedented challenges as he attempted to balance the college's academic mission with its responsibilities to the broader community. His experience with dangerous magical research would have provided valuable perspective on the risks and opportunities presented by attempts to understand and counter undead imperial power. The college's library and research facilities would have become crucial resources in any effort to develop effective strategies for dealing with dragons and their undead master. Faralda, the college's expert in destruction magic, would have found her expertise in magical combat suddenly relevant to far more than academic discussion and student training. The techniques and principles she taught for dealing with hostile mages and magical creatures would have required adaptation for use against enemies whose power and methods were beyond normal magical categories. Her role as gatekeeper for college admission would have taken on new significance as the institution sought to recruit individuals with the potential to contribute to the province's magical defense. The Thieves' Guild, traditionally focused on personal enrichment through illicit means, would have been forced to choose between profitable collaboration with the new regime and resistance activities that could threaten their very existence. The Guild's extensive network of contacts and informants throughout Skyrim would have made them valuable allies for any resistance movement, while their skills in stealth, infiltration, and information gathering would have been crucial for intelligence operations against an enemy whose plans and capabilities were largely unknown. Brynjolf, the Guild's de facto leader, would have faced difficult decisions about whether the organization's traditional neutrality in political matters could be maintained in the face of an existential threat to the province's independence. His experience with risk assessment and strategic planning would have provided valuable perspective on the challenges and opportunities presented by resistance activities against supernatural enemies. The Guild's traditional focus on avoiding unnecessary violence would have been tested by the need to confront opponents whose power made conventional criminal activities seem trivial by comparison. Delvin Mallory, the Guild's expert in various criminal specialties, would have found his skills in demand for purposes far removed from traditional thievery. His knowledge of security systems, guard routines, and architectural weaknesses would have been valuable for resistance planning, while his contacts throughout Skyrim's criminal underworld would have provided access to resources and information unavailable through legitimate channels. The Guild's traditional code of conduct would have been challenged by the moral implications of resistance activities that might require violence against beings whose humanity was questionable. The Dark Brotherhood, already serving supernatural forces through their worship of the Night Mother, would have faced complex questions about whether their assassination contracts extended to undead targets and how their philosophy of death as liberation applied to beings who had seemingly transcended mortality. The Brotherhood's traditional role as agents of death would have been complicated by an enemy for whom death had proven to be merely a temporary inconvenience rather than a final resolution. Astrid, the leader of Skyrim's Dark Brotherhood sanctuary, would have struggled with the implications of an enemy who had apparently achieved a form of immortality that mocked the Brotherhood's core beliefs about the nature and finality of death. Her pragmatic approach to guild leadership would have been tested by the need to adapt traditional assassination techniques for use against targets whose relationship to mortality was fundamentally different from that of normal humans. The Brotherhood's contracts and methods would have required complete re-evaluation in light of enemies who might not respond to conventional approaches to death and dying. The Cicero situation, already a source of tension within the Brotherhood due to his loyalty to tradition versus practical adaptation, would have taken on new dimensions as the organization grappled with an enemy whose very existence challenged their fundamental assumptions about death and its meaning. His devotion to the Night Mother and traditional Brotherhood practices might have provided valuable insights into supernatural aspects of death and undeath that could prove crucial in understanding and combating the undead Emperor. The various holds of Skyrim would have served as individual theaters in a larger strategic conflict, each presenting unique challenges and opportunities based on their geographic position, resources, and political leadership. The eastern holds, closest to the sea routes from Akavir, would have faced the most immediate threat from invasion forces, while also being positioned to provide early warning and initial resistance. The western holds, more removed from immediate danger but crucial for supply lines and strategic depth, would have faced different challenges related to resource allocation and population management. Riften, with its position near the southern border and its reputation for corruption and criminal activity, would have presented both opportunities and challenges for resistance planning. The hold's extensive smuggling networks and criminal organizations would have provided valuable resources for clandestine operations, while the political corruption that plagued local government would have complicated efforts to organize effective resistance. Maven Blackbriar's influence over local politics and economics would have made her a crucial figure in determining the hold's response to invasion. Windhelm, as the stronghold of Stormcloak resistance and the ancient capital of Nordic kingdoms, would have held enormous symbolic importance for both sides in the conflict. The city's massive stone walls and defensible position would have made it a natural fortress for resistance activities, while its political significance would have made it a high-priority target for any invasion force seeking to establish legitimacy and control. The presence of Ulfric's Stormcloak and his supporters would have guaranteed that Windhelm would be a center of resistance regardless of the broader political situation. Solitude, as the current seat of imperial power in Skyrim and the location of the Blue Palace, would have faced the ultimate test of its loyalty and defensive capabilities. The city's position on the northwest coast would have provided some protection from seaborne invasion, but its political importance would have made it a crucial target for any force seeking to establish control over the province. General Tullius and his imperial forces would have been responsible for coordinating the province's overall defense from their headquarters in the city. Markarth, with its unique Dwemer architecture and strategic position in the Reach, would have presented both defensive advantages and political complications. The city's stone construction and defensible position would have made it difficult to capture, but the ongoing conflict with forsworn rebels would have complicated efforts to organize unified resistance. The Silver Blood family's control over local politics and economics would have made them crucial allies or dangerous enemies depending on their decision about which side to support. Falkreath, positioned near Skyrim's southern border with Cyrodiil, would have served as a crucial link to imperial resources and reinforcements, while also being vulnerable to forces moving north from the Heartland provinces. The Hold's extensive forests would have provided opportunities for guerrilla warfare and concealment, but its small population would have limited its ability to contribute significant forces to any resistance effort. The political loyalty of local leadership would have been crucial in determining whether the Hold served as a conduit for imperial support or a barrier to effective coordination. The various smaller settlements throughout Skyrim would have faced their own unique challenges as they attempted to survive in a province under siege by supernatural forces. Riverwood, despite its small size, would have been strategically important due to its position along major transportation routes and its relationship with both Whiterun and Helgen. The village's lumber mill and its skilled workers would have been valuable resources for any effort to construct fortifications or siege equipment. Rorikstead, with its agricultural focus and strategic position in western Skyrim, would have been crucial for food production and supply line security. The village's apparent prosperity, despite its remote location, might have hidden secrets or resources that could prove valuable in the coming conflict. The loyalty and capabilities of local leadership would have determined whether the settlement served as a reliable supply base for resistance forces or a target for enemy occupation and resource extraction. Ivarstead, positioned at the base of the throat of the world and along the pilgrimage route to High Hrothgar, would have taken on enormous significance due to its proximity to the Greybeards and their ancient knowledge of the Thu'um. The village's position would have made it a natural staging area for any attempt to seek assistance from the reclusive masters of dragon shouts, while its small size and remote location would have made it vulnerable to enemy forces seeking to cut off access to the mountain. The innkeeper Klimek and other residents would have found themselves thrust into roles far beyond their normal experience as their quiet village became a crucial strategic location. The Greybeards themselves would have faced unprecedented challenges as their ancient isolation was shattered by the return of dragons serving an undead imperial master. Their philosophy of peaceful meditation and restraint in the use of the Thu'um would have been tested by the immediate practical need to provide guidance and training to those who would fight against the dragon threat. Master Arngir's traditional reluctance to share the secrets of dragon shouts with outsiders would have been challenged by the reality that such knowledge might be essential for Skyrim's survival. High Hrothgar, the ancient monastery atop the throat of the world, would have become a pilgrimage destination, not for spiritual enlightenment, but for practical training in the arts of dragon communication and combat. The monastery's isolation and defensible position would have made it a natural fortress for resistance planning, while the Greybeards' extensive knowledge of dragon lore would have been crucial for understanding the enemy's capabilities and potential weaknesses. The word walls scattered throughout the monastery would have taken on new significance as training materials rather than historical artifacts. Paarthurnax, the ancient dragon who leads the Greybeards, would have faced the ultimate test of his reformed philosophy as he confronted dragons serving an undead master who represented everything he had rejected about his own past. His knowledge of dragon psychology and politics would have been invaluable for understanding the enemy's organization and methods, while his own status as a reformed servant of evil would have provided unique insights into the possibilities for turning enemy dragons against their master. The moral complexities of his situation would have been enhanced by questions about whether dragons could truly change their nature or whether their service to different masters simply reflected different forms of the same fundamental drive for domination. The ancient dragon burial sites scattered throughout Skyrim would have served fundamentally different narrative purposes under this alternative storyline. Instead of being primarily sources of dragon souls for the player character to absorb, these locations might have been revealed as strategic positions established by previous generations in preparation for the return of dragon-based threats. The dragons buried in these sites might not have been ancient servants of Ulduin awakening to resume their war against mortality, but rather defenders who had died protecting Skyrim from previous Akaviri incursions and whose spirits could potentially be awakened to serve in the current crisis. The various Dwemer ruins throughout Skyrim would have taken on new significance as repositories of advanced technology that might prove crucial in the fight against supernatural enemies. The Dwemer's mysterious disappearance and their reputation for technological innovation would have suggested that their abandoned cities and fortresses might contain weapons or defenses specifically designed to counter dragon threats. The complex mechanical devices found in these ruins might not have been merely academic curiosities, but practical tools that could be adapted for use in the current conflict. Blackreach, the vast underground cavern system beneath Skyrim, would have provided opportunities for hidden bases, supply routes, and emergency refuges that would have been crucial for any resistance movement facing enemies with aerial superiority. The cavern's unique ecosystem and its population of Falmer would have presented both challenges and opportunities for resistance forces seeking to use the underground network for strategic advantage. The ancient Dwemer city of Ulftand and other major ruins connected to Blackreach would have served as potential staging areas for operations that required secrecy and security from dragon surveillance. The Falmer themselves, the twisted descendants of the once proud snow elves, would have presented complex moral and strategic questions for resistance planners. Their hostility to surface dwellers would have made them natural enemies of any organized defense effort, but their knowledge of underground routes and their hatred of dragons might have made them potential allies against a common enemy. The tragic history of their transformation from civilized elves to savage underground dwellers would have provided a grim preview of what might await Skyrim's population if the Undead Emperor's conquest succeeded. The College of Winterhold's investigation into the Eye of Magnus and other powerful magical artifacts would have taken on new urgency as the need for weapons capable of harming supernatural enemies became apparent. The Eye's immense power and mysterious origins would have suggested that it might be a relic from previous conflicts between mortal and divine forces, potentially holding secrets that could prove crucial in the current crisis. The college's research into the artifact would have been driven not by academic curiosity, but by desperate practical need for any advantage that might tip the balance against overwhelming enemy power. Ankano, the Thalmor agent embedded within the College of Winterhold, would have faced complex loyalties as his people's traditional hostility to imperial power was complicated by the return of an undead emperor whose methods and allies threatened the stability of all existing political arrangements. The Thalmor's long-term goal of weakening human imperial power would have been challenged by the immediate threat posed by an emperor whose supernatural abilities and dragon allies represented a form of imperial authority far more dangerous than anything they had previously encountered. The various Daedric quests and artifacts scattered throughout Skyrim would have taken on new significance as potential tools or allies in the fight against undead imperial power. The Daedric princes' complex relationships with mortal politics and their individual spheres of influence would have created opportunities for alliances and conflicts that went far beyond the relatively straightforward good versus evil dynamic of the final game. Mehrunes Dagon's fear of destruction and change might have made him a natural ally for those seeking to overthrow the established order, while Molag Bal's association with Undeath might have put him in competition or collaboration with the Undead Emperor. The Ebony Blade, traditionally associated with betrayal and murder among trusted allies, would have presented fascinating moral questions for heroes forced to consider whether betraying friends and allies might be justified by the greater good of defeating an existential threat. The blade's requirement for blood sacrifice from those who trust the wielder would have created opportunities for genuine moral dilemmas that went far beyond simple combat effectiveness considerations. Azura's Star, the reusable soul gem associated with the Daedric Prince of Dawn and Dusk, would have been crucial for any magical research or weapon enchantment efforts directed against supernatural enemies. The artifact's ability to capture and store souls would have raised questions about the nature of undead souls and whether the Emperor's essence could be trapped or manipulated using conventional magical techniques. The moral implications of soul manipulation would have been enhanced by uncertainty about whether undead beings possessed souls in the traditional sense. The various standing stones scattered throughout Skyrim would have served as more than mere character development tools, potentially functioning as ancient magical focuses that could be activated or modified to provide strategic advantages in the coming conflict. The Lord Stone's defensive properties, the Atronach Stone's magical absorption abilities, and the Serpent Stone's poison effects might have been enhanced or redirected to serve as weapons against dragon enemies or their undead master. The companions' transformation into werewolves would have provided an interesting parallel and potential countermeasure to the undead emperor's supernatural condition. The beast blood that cursed and empowered the Circle members represented a form of supernatural transformation that, while not equivalent to undeath, demonstrated that the boundaries between human and monster were more flexible than most people assumed. The question of whether lycanthropy could provide protection against undead influence, or whether it represented a similar form of supernatural corruption, would have added complexity to the guild's internal struggles. The werewolf transformation itself would have taken on strategic significance beyond its combat applications, potentially providing enhanced senses, speed, and durability that could prove crucial for reconnaissance and harassment operations against enemy forces. The lycanthrope's enhanced healing abilities and resistance to disease might have provided protection against whatever supernatural corruption had transformed the Emperor, while their pack hunting instincts could have been valuable for coordinating group tactics against dragon enemies. Hircine, the Daedric Prince of the Hunt, would have found the return of dragons and their undead master to be the ultimate hunting challenge, potentially leading to direct intervention in mortal affairs on a scale rarely seen in previous Elder Scrolls games. His sphere of influence over predators and prey relationships would have been directly relevant to conflicts between mortal hunters and dragon quarry, while his association with lycanthropy would have made him a natural patron for the companions and other werewolf characters. The various vampire clans hidden throughout Skyrim would have faced complex decisions about their response to an undead emperor whose condition paralleled their own in some ways while differing dramatically in others. The vampires' immortality and supernatural powers would have made them potentially valuable allies or dangerous enemies, depending on their assessment of whether the emperor's rule would benefit or threaten their existing arrangements. The question of whether different forms of undeath could coexist or whether they were inherently competitive would have added layers of complexity to the political landscape. Castle Volkihar and the ancient vampire Lord Harkon would have represented a significant wildcard in any conflict involving undead imperial power. Harkon's own ambitions for supernatural dominance and his complex relationship with prophecy and destiny would have made him either a rival to the Emperor or a potential ally, depending on their respective goals and methods. The Vampire Lord's mastery of blood magic and necromancy would have provided unique insights into the nature of undeath that could prove crucial for understanding and potentially countering the Emperor's condition. The Dawn Guard, the ancient organization dedicated to hunting vampires and other undead threats, would have found their traditional mission expanded to encompass threats on a scale they had never previously encountered. Their expertise in combating supernatural enemies and their knowledge of undead weaknesses would have made them natural leaders in any resistance movement, while their specialized weapons and training would have been crucial for developing effective tactics against dragon-mounted undead forces. Isran, the leader of the reformed Dawn Guard, would have found his organization transformed from a relatively small group of vampire hunters into a crucial military force responsible for defending all of Skyrim against supernatural invasion. His experience with undead psychology and combat tactics would have provided valuable perspective on the challenges and opportunities presented by an enemy whose power transcended normal categories of supernatural threat. The various Nordic ruins and burial sites throughout Skyrim would have served as more than atmospheric set pieces, potentially functioning as strategic resources that contained weapons, information, or allies that could prove crucial in the coming conflict. The ancient Nords who built these sites had faced dragon threats before, and their architectural choices and burial practices might have reflected hard-won knowledge about effective countermeasures against such enemies. The Draugr that inhabited these ancient sites would have represented more than simple undead guardians, potentially serving as sources of information about previous conflicts with dragons and their masters. Some of these ancient warriors might have retained enough awareness and loyalty to Nordic independence to serve as allies rather than enemies, providing both combat support and tactical knowledge based on centuries or millennia of experience. The dragon claws that served as keys to various Nordic ruins would have taken on significance beyond their puzzle-solving function, potentially representing a security system designed to prevent enemy forces from accessing crucial resources or information. The fact that these keys were scattered throughout Skyrim rather than being kept in central locations might have reflected ancient strategic planning for exactly the type of crisis that the province now faced. The word walls found throughout these ruins would have served as more than sources of dragon shouts for the player character, potentially functioning as training materials for an entire generation of Thuum practitioners who would be needed to communicate with and potentially command dragons in the coming conflict. The ancient knowledge preserved in these stone monuments might have included not just individual shouts, but comprehensive tactical doctrines for dragon-based warfare. The various guilds and organizations throughout Skyrim would have found their missions and methods fundamentally altered by the scale and nature of the threat they faced. The traditional boundaries between legitimate and criminal activities would have become largely meaningless in the face of an existential threat that required all available resources and capabilities. The question of whether established social and legal structures could survive the crisis intact would have been a constant theme throughout the narrative. The political implications of resistance activities would have extended far beyond Skyrim's borders, potentially affecting the stability and legitimacy of imperial rule throughout Tamriel. If a legitimate Septim Emperor could return from the dead to reclaim his throne, what did that mean for the current political arrangements that had emerged following the dynasty's official end? The various provinces that had achieved independence or autonomy following the Oblivion Crisis would have been forced to reconsider their positions in light of this unprecedented development. The economic disruption caused by dragon attacks and military mobilization would have created additional challenges for resistance planning and civilian survival. Trade routes would have become dangerous or impossible to maintain. Agricultural production would have been disrupted by the need to keep populations in defensible locations, and the normal economic relationships that sustained civilized life would have broken down under the pressure of constant warfare against supernatural enemies. The psychological impact of facing an enemy whose very existence challenged basic assumptions about life, death, and the natural order would have been as significant as the immediate military threat. The morale and mental health of both military forces and civilian populations would have required constant attention and support as people struggled to maintain hope and purpose in the face of seemingly impossible odds. The question of whether victory was even possible against an enemy with such overwhelming advantages would have been a constant theme throughout the narrative, creating opportunities for character development and philosophical exploration that went far beyond simple combat encounters. The traditional heroic narrative of individual champions defeating great evils would have been complicated by the scale and complexity of the threat, requiring collective action and sacrifice on a scale rarely seen in fantasy gaming. The ultimate resolution of such a conflict would have required not just military victory, but fundamental changes to the political, social, and spiritual structures that governed life in Tamriel. The return of an undead Septim Emperor would have forced a complete reevaluation of concepts like legitimate rule, the relationship between life and death, and the proper role of supernatural power in mortal affairs. The consequences of such a conflict would have echoed through subsequent Elder Scrolls games in ways that the relatively contained dragon crisis of the final version never could.